Hello everyone, and welcome to the show.
If you should awaken, I will be there when you wake from your lovely
Welcome back. Today we will be introducing chapter 33 and 34, Hermes and Anki, and Edin too. But before I get into that, I'd like to remind everyone why we're all here, what my main purpose is. My main purpose is to differentiate between the creator of all things and the biblical gods. I believe that it is giving a disservice to the creator of all things to compare him to the limited beings that created mankind. That's why I wrote the book. So today I would like to examine 3 words that's attributed to God. One of the words is omnipotent. Now, omnipotent simply means unlimited power. There's another word called omniscient. I believe that particular word's knowing all of science. Omnipotent, omniscience, and omnipresent, which really means he is everywhere at all times. Now, the issue that I have with some of these words as it relates to the biblical gods, for example, the Garden of Eden story. Why did he go looking in the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve? Why did he not know why they were clothed, for instance? When Yahweh said, "Who told you you were naked?" Why did Yahweh not know the answer to these questions? The answers are very simple. The Elohims of the book of Genesis did not possess these qualities. No, they were just advanced beings. You see, now, when you're dealing with the creator of the universe, you have to consider what one great philosopher said, and he said that trying to think of something that thought cannot think. That's kind of an older ideology of what we've come to know about the creator, because there's a lot of things that we've come to know now that in the past we had no idea how to even relate to when it comes to the positioning and the structure. See, I believe we know where the creator of the universe lives, for instance. I've told people on several occasions, if you want to see where God, the creator, lives, simply go outside on a star-spangled night and look out. What you are seeing is you are looking at the Creator from the inside out. Once your eyes focus on anything, well, wouldn't that mean that a being that is everywhere is within that preview or that purview? Anything that you see is a part of the Creator. The old Gnostics had a name for the Creator of the universe. They called him the Demiurge. By definition, it meant the maintainer and sustainer of the fabric of the universe. And so now we've broken this thing down to a point where what it turns into is a big, giant paradox. One of the largest paradox when you consider an omnipotent being is that his conflicts with Satan, for instance. An omnipotent being is going to know the past, present, and the future. And would he not already have had a relationship with Lucifer? What I mean by that is whatever could have happened between the two, it had already happened in the mind of the Creator. So, in my opinion, this conflict could have been easily avoided. Not to mention the fact that Satan himself would not be able to battle or contend with said Creator. And that's just one of the things. One of my biggest problems with the biblical gods are the fact that, number one, I've done a little research and I've come to find out that there were more religions than I had previously thought. If you go back far enough, you will find that in this world, from the time they started recording things such as religion, they have found over 10,000 religions. And within those religions, there are more than 1,000 different gods, which obviously means that the Creator of the universe has little to do with the literature that is within those books. It's all things that are man-made, because if the Creator wanted to make said book, he would make the others impossible to write, because he would already know that human beings would not be able to tell the difference. And not to mention the fact that all Lucifer has to do is throw a few in there to confuse the pot. But let us get to some of the chapters we have here. Number 33, Hermes and Anki. Hermes and Anki, the flood just ended. Hermes decided he was going to land in the rich area that was now flat after being flooded of Egypt. There was nothing there at the time, but they were able to raise the Giza plateau. This is before the pyramids were made and the Sphinx. So once they raised the Giza plateau, they were then able to set up civilizations there. But however, the beings that were around at the time were cavemen. So they had very little help in the construction therein of all the monuments and the buildings so you have a situation where the beings that were there had to be risen to a level of societal existence. These were barbarians, cavemen, like I said, so they had to be taught everything. They had to be taught how to walk upright, how to keep from eating each other, and the whole nine yards. So this is what was going on when Hermes landed. Anki had a less provocative encounter. There was no one there in Mesopotamia when he landed. So that's where he set up Edin too. Let's check out this chapter. Hermes and Anki.
Chapter 33. Hermes and Anki.
Hermes and Anki settled on 2 locations. Hermes landed his skyship in the upper region in the land of Kim, on the continent which is now called Africa at Egypt. Anki landed his vessel in the gold-rich land called Kin, or Nubia, while brother Enlil remained in Sumer. Upon his arrival at the place where he had selected, Hermes saw that there were cave-dwelling humanoids that were the descendants of Adam and Eve that had ventured far into the deserts and were now living in the mountain regions. Once the waters had subsided, they traveled the lands in search of food and drinkable water. They were able to survive once they arrived at the Nile River Valley, where they found fresh water and fish to sustain themselves. They traveled in groups of about 200 in an attempt to increase their chances of survival. One such group of cave dwellers observed in the distance a shiny object hovering over the skies near a plateau. So mystified by the object that they could only freeze in their tracks, because of the lack of shelter in the area. Even though they had never before seen anything like, or remotely like this, they seemed unafraid, becoming angered and aggressive at the unfamiliarity of it all. Hermes landed his ship in a clearing on a distant mound that had been raised by the floodwaters. Instead of running away from the vessel, the hairy barbarians, as they would later be called, rushed toward it in what seemed to be an attempt to destroy what they did not understand. Upon the sight of them, Hermes began to create a very large dust cloud on the mound in an attempt to frighten them. This only seemed to agitate them even more as they scurried around to rid themselves of the flying sands. Hermes then sat the vessel down in the space that had been vacated by the beings. They stood back for a moment as if they were waiting to see if this was some sort of flying creature with teeth that would attempt to devour them. After Hermes sat the ship down for a moment, he then opened the sliding doors on the underbelly of the vessel and stepped down the stairs onto terra firma. The hairy barbarians began snarling, growling and howling at Hermes and his vessel as other Atlantans began to venture out to assist Hermes if need be. Hermes told his comrades to stay aboard the vessel until he calmed the situation. He could tell that the primitive, non-language speaking beings needed only a bit of wonder to tame their savage nature. He then raised his weapon that resembled a decorated staff-like object, pointing it in the direction in front of the beings as a sound wave emanated from the staff. The sound wave seemed to freeze all the beings in the first several meters of the staff, as all other barbarians also remained motionless as if they too were frozen by fright. After seeing what the vessel and its inhabitants were capable of, they calmly laid down their arms and themselves in what seemed to be an act of submission. In the land of Ken, or Nubia, Anki seemed to have had a much less provocative introduction. There was no one there to be confronted by. This was quite surprising after hearing all the reports of mass gold deposits that were detected from the ships above the area. So in the year 363 the formation of the land began, though the number of the year coincided with the calendar of the Anunnaki. An Earth calendar had not yet been created but would soon be created by the new ruler Hermes, who was now called Thoth. Hermes felt that he needed a change just because it was his first time being a ruler, like his father and uncles. Thoth's father and uncles were the Titans that were the deities that preceded the Olympians, of which included Hermes and brother Apollo as well as many others. Anki too would now be called Ta and Marduk, Ra the sun god. These gods of old ruled Egypt long before the first pharaohs and long before Dynasty 0. It would take many Earth years to rise the barbarians to an expectable level of humanity, but time they had plenty, and over the years they would become one community, whose behavior would be molded by Thoth, as well as the new Anunnaki leader, Marduk, son of Anki. Anki immediately began reforming the landscape, raising the Giza Plateau high above its original height. He chose to help his son before continuing his own operation at Nubia. Thoth and Anki erected 2 very large pyramids at Giza as well as a large lion to symbolize the region. All this before the barbarians were able to speak. One day while Ra was away, Thoth hurried to operate the unguarded, computer numerical control shaping machine. He proceeded to enter into the machine the perfect depiction of his likeness, and in minutes he reshaped the lion's head to resemble himself, changing it from a perfect lion to what would forever be called the Sphinx. He also bored great caverns underneath the structure so that he could hide his space vessel before the barbarians were able to figure out exactly what it was. Anki too would hide his vessel that became known as the Celestial Boat, or barge, although not very carefully. In fact, his vessel would resemble a rather large golden bird with shiny wings stationed at the earth port and towers at Babel. This mighty vessel would burrow itself beneath the ashes and soil upon landing, and would come to symbolize the phoenix each time it rose to the heavens, thus coining the phrase. The gods were now in Egypt and Mesopotamia and would soon bore offspring that would be part earth human and Anunnaki gods. The particular beings would be called demigods, and their bloodlines appear pervasively throughout history. Wherever there were rulers, there would be this bloodline. Even Donald Trump and Barack Obama are distant relatives, as well as all but one American president by way of King John of England. The only president not to share this bloodline is the Dutch-rooted Martin van Buren.
Subscribe and push the like button.
Welcome back. Now, chapter 34, Eden 2, describes basically what it was like to enter into the regeneration of mankind. You see, Adam and Eve had already been realized. Adam and Eve were perfection. The second round of human beings that were created, mysteriously enough, were not created in the same way that Adam and Eve was. So in the second variation, they took a particular primate that was already had all the qualities, hand dexterities, and walked upright. It was called the bonobo, and they took that particular primate and were able to replicate humans a lot faster than all the years that it took to create Adam and Eve. So anyway, come back as soon as you finish chapter 34, then I'll be here.
Chapter 34, Eden 2.
This garden was not your ordinary garden variety. This garden was the size of a small continent from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. The creator gods in the second cycle of creation replicated man until healthy groupings of several hundred or more survived. Regrettably, hundreds of monstrosities were discarded by means of cremation and blended into the earth that made fertile the Garden of Eden's soil. In this variation, a particular primate would be used as the base material in an effort to simplify the extraordinarily complex animation of this new and much improved human generation. DNA was constantly modified in their structures to create the balance of chromosome threading. Full-term neonates had very short lives if the formulas were undesired. The trials seemed endless, yet the scientists were eager to prove their theories. This would amount to their search for fame or some form of divine recognition. The complications seemed acceptable until you reflect that the offspring of the creations were highly scrutinized, and some had to wait years after living to be regarded as discardable. Once they were permitted to mature, they were taught to stand upright, posturing them as much as possible. They were likened to the beast in the fields, naked without shame or understanding the reason to be so. They stood stone-faced, unaware and unconcerned that they were without clothing. This was the attempt to create the most complex creatures in the entire universe. Their desire was to create beings with an acceptable level of perfection with expedience. However, such perfection could only be accomplished by the patient creator of said universe. The All was fully aware of the creative's attempts to be creators, and felt that this would be a good opportunity to provide yet another much-needed moments of teaching for the many angels that longed for the experience of a corporeal life. He allowed them to not only leave heaven for a time, but to enter into human avatars as well. It took these angels a while to get used to the many organs needed to live in this state. Organs such as the stomachs, which immediately began to ache because of lack of food therein. The muscular system just happened to be compatible with the movements already used by the angels. The nervous system, head and the absence of wings were the most challenging, not to mention the digestive systems. They soon learned just how to go about that, and the angels found it most amazing the things one finds out when one steps out of one's zone of comfort. After discovering thirst, one angel also discovered the side effect of drinking as he stood in place, as his urinary tract did exactly what it was designed to do. Others felt great anxiety over the extreme discomfort of this thing called pain. It became quite obvious that the angels found it far more difficult to be human than did the newly created humans. Some found breathing to be quite pleasing, while others found things like sandals necessary. The angels could never have imagined how uncomfortable rocks could feel to be stood upon with these solid things called feet. Though angels were sent to assist the new beings, it was the plan of God to make an example of them. In the future, they would perhaps prefer to stay in their heavens and not chase waterfalls. The new beings would be called Ihans, the new Abel, and since they were begotten from both the earth and the spirit of heaven, they were said to be conceived of the Lord. The next race of beings were born from earth only, and would be called Asu, Adam, or Homo habilis. Contrary to the biblical offspring of Adam and Eve, Abel referred to the Ihans' capability of understanding spiritual things. These were just some of the many names, words and phrases used in the Bible metaphorically. It stands to reason that an entire race of mankind was simply a play on words, not the actual sons of a being called Adam. In fact, Adam and Eve had already been realized before the flood. Eve's were the names given to the design of the first to be the contrary of the sterile female. These beings were exceptional. Entire reproductive systems were operable in harmonious synchronicity. Out of all the living and breathing things, they were the only creations that had the ability to understand the concept of a master, or creator if you will. In the very confusing serpent myth, the snake was punished by being condemned to remain in the only circumstance he was accustomed. Thus the angels were found to be very useful. They had the ability to communicate with the new beings with simple telepathic gestures. Perhaps this was because they too were very new to their physiological situation. Angels proceeded to impart to the Ihans to go forth and hide their nakedness. This was the first commandment of the Lord unto the new beings. The Ihans were so afraid of everything that they quickly adapted to the leadership of the angels. With the angels they found comfort. With everything else they were uneasy, and everything else seemed extremely worrisome towards them. Imagine being in a place where everything is unfamiliar and you have yet the instincts necessary to survive, or to know even the meaning thereof. The angels, being in a somewhat similar state, seemed to be more than useful and fully appreciated for a time. Eventually it was discovered by the Anunnaki that these angels were far from angelic. The angels began teaching the Ihans to be sexual in physical ways while the Anunnaki slept. Because of this, the angel avatars were taken away by God, but not before it was discovered that the mentors did in fact create offspring with their mentees. This fact was easily discovered when the female Ihans began to suffer when having these unusually gigantic babies. Because these offsprings were a product of the interaction of the angels and their large avatars, the angels were punished. They were given a time period of 6 generations to minister to the beings and the surviving giants' lineage. The old was somewhat surprised at the angels, knowing that God needed them for the benefit of the beings. God also had the advantage of knowing the future. Nonetheless, the angels did feel that the experience was well worth it, and they enjoyed the challenge. One of the first challenges was to teach them how to walk erect and to abstain from incest, which was quite difficult because of the inability to conceptualize family, or parents, or siblings, or structure. Another challenge was to keep separate the Ihans from the Asu Adams, for fear that their seed would go down into darkness. After a time, the Ihans began to feel as if there was no more to be taught, and they became narcissistic and conceited and wandered away from Ihans. They were also bothered by the fact that they were not permitted to have relations with the very attractive Asu Adams, though animalistic they may have seemed. After years of commingling, the Ihans and the Asu Adams begot a new race. The new race was called the Druks, the new Cain, or Australopithecus afarensis. These new beings were without the spiritual excellence of their forefathers and could not be taught things of a spiritual nature. One of the first tasks of the created ones were to gain the ability to grill hunted meat for the lords. This would be called the burnt offerings and were to be made pleasing to the lords. This task should have been within the abilities of the Droogs, so the Ihans attempted to teach their offspring to do the same and also please the lords. Perhaps this will gain favor that they too might be forgiven for the misdeeds of their parents. However, the Droogs could not be taught and chose to destroy and steal instead. They began killing and stealing in great numbers and were then banished into the forests and woods. They were then given the distinction of being a warring species. They were given the instincts to war until the end of time and beyond, and would begin to gather and form wandering tribes. Women of both the Asuadams and the Ihans were desperate to find a way to avoid mating with the Droogs. The difficulty of determining the difference between the species became the challenge. A plan was discussed by the leadership of the two peoples. The new plan was to mark the non-Droogs by way of circumcision. And so it was ordered that the male, both old and young, be circumcised. That woman would then learn to avoid those who were not. The Ihans then circumcised one another until the task was complete, for it was the testimony of the Lord to the woman that her seed have everlasting life. The Droogs, Cain, were then in the wilderness dealing with only themselves. However, Ihans and the Asuadams were taught to make and wear clothing and labor together. And so boundaries of cliffs and forest was made to separate the peoples. The Ihans would labor and create housing and clothing and culture, while the Droogs would wander in the wilderness without labor and without clothing.
Subscribe and push the like button.
Thank you for coming.
I'll be there when you wait for your love.
Subscribe and push the like button.